We're coming off the summer, so there's a church in Missouri, church camp. Beautiful facility, great swimming pool, and in great condition. They had no diving board, which from an insurance perspective is good, no slide. But they decided, the lifeguards and some friends decided to kind of bring in an inflatable blow-up slide they bought at a big box retailer. Thought it'd be fun for the kids. It wasn't really made for that setting. It was for backyard kind of setting. So the kids are having a great time going down that slide. Comes to the end of the day and they're like, lifeguard, please go down, go down, go down. So they're encouraging him. So it's about a 6-foot slide. He goes down head first. Slide moves. He moves. Hits the concrete deck with his head and into the swimming pool. And so, very unfortunately, he broke several cervical discs or cervical bones in his neck, and ended up as a quadriplegic. So he was never to walk again in that moment of fun. And so, from his perspective, it's a horrible tragedy. From his family's perspective, he was in his young 20s, so the rest of his life he's going to need care. He's going to back in the home. From the kids, that were kind of egging him on, kind of the guilt and the feeling horrible about the incident. From the church camp perspective, what happened to their lifeguard. And the monetary perspective, he's a worker, so it was workers' compensation insurance. But that's a lifetime of care of somebody for quadriplegia in the millions of dollars. So for the insurance company, it's lose, lose, lose all the way around in that moment of fun. So somewhat similarly, a church wanted to have a youth event, something fun, youth activity with an earth ball, so like 5 or 6 feet diameter earth ball, inflatable. And they thought it'd be fun to kind of have like a slip and slide kind of around it. So they put down a tarp in the church parking lot, kind of made it soapy to be slippery. So one of the kids in the earth ball event is kind of going and trying to get up on the ball, comes down, again hits his head on the ground, the tarp over the concrete or asphalt, and fractured his skull. Which is, again, it's lose-lose all the way around. And I tell you those stories not to tell you about the horror stories that we have as an insurance company, but to me, particularly dealing with youth activities, it's what I call pinch points. There's certain pinch points, I call them, between kind of ministry and safety. So, and the pinch point, from my perspective on the youth side, is balancing fun with balancing what's safe. So that's what we hope to talk to today a little bit. Again, my name is Eric Spacek. I have the privilege to lead the risk control department at Church Mutual Insurance Company out of Merrill, up the road. So we insure about 90,000 religious organizations across the country, all 50 states, including the conference, so we're privileged to insure the conference. And myself, just where I'm coming from, I started out my career as a trial attorney. So out in Washington, D.C., I was defending organizations against injury claims and lawsuits for about 11 years. And it was very interesting, but also very kind of disturbing, right, to see all the worst case things. And so I really had a passion for getting ahead, preventing things from happening in the first place, how much better. Because as trial lawyer, you're just going to clean up and trying to limit the amount of money that you're going to give away. So I had a goal to kind of help churches across the country with safety and risk management. I like to say God had other plans for me, so I went from 11 years as a trial attorney to being a church business administrator for a church in North Carolina. So 3 years as a kind of inside the church, working at the church, and really I gained a tremendous perspective from doing that. I often say those 3 years working at the church was harder than the 11 years as a trial attorney. And I think from an emotional perspective and dealing with people and the issues, that was very much the case. And then a door opened up about 18 years ago to be able to help churches across the country do safety. And so for the last 18 years, I've worked for 3 insurance companies, 2 of them primarily focused on religious organizations. So, insurance companies are different things, right? So we as an insurance company, we're very much aligned, we like to think, with our policyholders, right? What we do is really to try to support what you do and to be there in the worst case scenario. But I'm privileged to be on the risk control side, so I don't sell insurance policies, which is good because I'm not a salesperson. I don't process claims or anything like that. Our department, about 30 of us across the country, our sole job is to help provide information, tools, resources, on-site visits to help a claim from happening in the first place. So, what are the claims? You know, we kind of see a lot, probably 20 to 25,000 claims per year. And insurance companies are a little different. We kind of think of things in terms of the line of business that we cover. So there's property, so property claims, fire, water, wind, hail. Liability claims, people getting injured. Workers' compensation claims, so those that are injured on the job at church. Business auto, so automobile type claims. And then there's umbrella coverage, which is kind of on top of all that. So we see the losses in each of those categories. I'm not going to talk today about property, since we're really here to talk about kind of Pathfinders and youth safety. And so that really falls within the general liability claim area, and to some degree workers' compensation claims for those workers that are working, paid workers that are working with the youth as well. And so just generally, and this isn't youth specific, but from a general liability standpoint. So in other words, somebody at a church or church-related activity or camp gets hurt and makes a claim against the church, which is very common. We like to think, they're within the church too, right? So they're not going to make a claim. It happens all the time. What would you guess would be the number one reason why somebody's getting hurt at church? Oh, she said falls. Far and away. Number one, again, insurance companies are a little different, right? So when we look at claims, we consider both frequency, how often these claims are happening, and then severity, when they do happen, how much do they cost? So some things are more frequent, some things are more severe, but on the people side, far and away, slipping and falling is the number one cause of loss. And that's not really uncommon for commercial insurance. It's somewhat specific to churches because we tend to have older populations at church for other factors, but even retail stores and that kind of thing, falls are far and away the number one. So we've got falls. Then it's kind of a category. It's not really a particular fact pattern, but it's just called inadequate supervision. So somebody gets hurt, typically a younger person. They weren't being supervised, and so the claim against the church is negligence for lack of supervision. So that's number two, if you will, in terms of our liability claims. Number three, which kind of gets into the auto piece too, is motor vehicle accident injuries as well. So we've got falls, inadequate supervision, motor vehicle accidents, and then one of my favorites, which is categorized at our company as physical activity / athletic activity. So here we're getting into the youth type things. At other places it might be called recreational activities. And then lastly, might surprise you, it's further down the list, is sexual abuse and misconduct. And, that's it's a horrible thing, but it's very common. So that's kind of, it's lower down the list in terms of frequency, but higher on the list in terms of severity. When it does happen, it's a big deal, not just emotionally and tragically for the victim, but financially for the church and the insurance company. So, like I said, that list isn't specific to youth-related activities, so I guess three things I was hoping to talk about today, and hopefully a discussion to answer any questions, is three areas of safety specifically related to youth. We just talked about one of them a little bit, safe from abuse. And a second biggie in my mind is safe from injury. So that's where we're getting into those athletic activities, physical activities, inadequate supervision. And then lastly is, in this day and age, safe from violence. So something we may not think about quite as much. We may think of it more in terms of the church setting, but even in the youth setting, safety from violence. So let's talk first about safety from abuse, which is not a fun topic, right? Just here's Church Mutual data. We see between 3 and 4 sexual abuse and misconduct claims every week. So about 200 per year or so, which is consistent with my experience at another religious-based insurance companies as well. And of those, 60% relate to child victims of abuse by an adult. What we often don't think about is 20% of those are minor on minor abuse claims, peer-to-peer, 20%. So the claim being you weren't supervising this child did something to this other child, and so you, organization, you church are responsible for that. So that's 20% of the time. And then 20% that we won't talk about today is adult victims of abuse and misconduct, typically in the pastoral, counseling, mentoring type relationship. So what do we do about the child sexual abuse issue? And thankfully, a lot of organizations, including the conference, do a lot on that. I know there's required things that happen here. But just the basic steps, and maybe this is kind of old knowledge to you, but screening, training, supervision, and then responding or reporting a situation. Kind of the keys from our perspective, right? And we partner with an organization called Ministry Safe, also has a kind of a non-religious branch called Abuse Prevention Systems, and so we definitely encourage our policyholders to take advantage of that. Material, although I know there's a lot of good material related to Pathfinders as well. But so screening, when you say screening, I think a lot of people think right away criminal background checks. So that's what screening is, and I get it. I mean, that's definitely part of it, but that's just a part. I guess the data that we see is that most offenders that are ultimately caught, only have 10% of those have some sort of criminal background. So 90% of those would not be caught on a criminal background check. So it's a tool, but not the silver bullet. Sometimes when I talk to organizations about screening, it's like, we do background checks, we're good. So there's a part to it. I guess I think of it like there's a part about you do get information from background checks, those that are convicted. And there's that part about kind of meeting your standard of care. As organizations, we don't guarantee safety. Our legal liability isn't to be a guarantor of safety. It's to take reasonable steps, to take reasonable care, to keep those under our charge safe. And so one way to show that is to show that we are screened by doing criminal background checks. And so, not unlike, maybe it's a poor analogy, but not unlike if somebody has a motorcycle accident, you read about it in the paper, and the first thing that you often hear is were they wearing a helmet or not. Kind of somewhat related to that, if there's a horrible incident of abuse, and they kind of point fingers at the organization, one of the first questions is, did they have a background check or not? Are they doing background checks or not? And so it serves a place of both screening to a degree, but also meeting your obligations as far as reasonable care and avoiding or limiting legal liability. But to me, screening goes beyond that. It's even for volunteers, we would posit to do an application form, and again, it gets to one of those pinch points, right? We talked earlier about that pinch point between fun and safety. This pinch point, in my mind, is we need people to help, we need volunteers, but we have to do certain things before we can let them volunteer with kids. And so it's a bit of a tension too, but in our view, having that written application form is an important step in the screening process. And then to go from there, to have the criminal background check, and then importantly, to do reference checks. And this is both employees as well as volunteers that we would recommend that to get what information you can, ideally not from places where they've worked necessarily, but from places where they've either volunteered or spent time caring for children in other settings, so that you can get that information and document it. And then an interview, kind of an in-person interview with it once you've gotten the application, the criminal background check, the reference checks, and then interview with the person to try to get information, understand the comfort level. And another screening tool, if you will, that a lot of churches use, and I'm not sure if it's used here, is a kind of a 6-month rule, they call it. Have you heard of that? Where you want the individual volunteer or worker to be involved or engaged in the life of the church or organization for 6 months before they're allowed to be placed in a position with children. So does that sound familiar? Is that something I hadn't heard? So again, it has a place about, if you think about it, in today's day and age, and this comes from Ministry Safe and the research, right? So of offenders, that kind of stranger danger is it's a small percent, because they're just strangers taking people off the street, something like 4 to 5% of the time. Most commonly, it's somebody known and trusted by the child, of course, at 90% of the time. And so, if you think about it in today's society, a person with a preference for children, which again, the data is suggesting that almost 90% of the time the offenders are someone that have a preference for children, want somewhere where there's quick and easy access. So if you go to Boys and Girls Clubs, if you go to YMCA, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, there's a pretty extensive program in place. Where sometimes isn't there an extensive program? And where churches? And where are we kind of in need of volunteers, and so we kind of want to take whatever help we can get. And so again, that gets to the heart of the issue and the need for those screening practices. Having screened them and then put them in place, there's training. So I know you all have been through training, right? There's training. I'm not really familiar with the training that's available to Pathfinders, but that's a great thing to have the training and then the policies in place in terms of supervision, because now we're really getting into the supervision part. So there's no hard and fast rule, you need X number of people for X number of kids. I mean, there is in schools, right? Or generally, if you have a class of this size, you need this many, but I guess the way we view it is kind of it's almost like a risk meter, kind of as risk increases, supervision should increase too. So if it's just a general Sabbath school class or church activity, the level of supervision may not be as high. And again, we always recommend kind of the two adult rule. You probably heard, right, that you don't necessarily want one adult with just children. But then as the activities become riskier, then the level of supervision should increase. So it's not a static number or static level of supervision. It's more of it's a sliding scale, if you will, depending on the activity. So what would you say, or what do you think are some of the things that would trigger higher supervision needs, do you think? Probably some things Pathfinder does. Camping, absolutely. Overnight settings.
Wood chopping class.
Wood chopping class, let's say. Power tools, that kind of thing. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So, how does supervision work with Pathfinders generally?
At least 2 adults have to be
2 adults
for Pathfinder.
Okay. So that gets into, though, kind of that peer-to-peer Houston, there's kind of two different scenarios there. Sometimes it's the kind of a little bit older teen with a somewhat younger teen, which is one scenario, and then sometimes it's really young kids, unfortunately. I mean, we see it. We're just relating a case about an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old on a playground within the play equipment where the supervisor couldn't see the kids, and the boy kind of took advantage, if you will, of the 6-year-old girl within the playground. And so again, it's that level of supervision, and you know, as our partners at ministry say too, it's a matter of kind of breaking through some of our mindsets too. That when they talk to the supervisors there, they were like, "This couldn't have happened. There's a fence outside, so nobody could come in and perpetrate the abuse." And it was actually the 2 kids within the program that were doing it because they weren't thinking necessarily that it would be 2 children within the young program that would be involved in an abusive situation. So it's very unfortunate. I hate talking about it, but it is part of the reality. And then in the camp setting, what we'll see, excuse me, is youth counselors. So again, it gets into the kind of the camp training and all those types of sessions about, you know, someone late teens or early 20s with a minor who's under 18 is not an uncommon scenario that we'll see in the camp setting. And then, you know, it's a consensual relationship. It's not a kind of a lawful relationship, if you will, and then it comes back to the camp, comes back to the organization, and really goes from there. So. Again, hate talking about it, but it's things to be just aware of. It's things that we as an insurance company see and that we try to prevent as much as we can through really pressing organizations on the supervision that they have for their programs, and keeping in mind about kind of the nature of that offender. Had someone at a really large camp organization in Missouri had 2 different occasions where he was the risk management director of the camp. 2 different occasions where somebody that he knew and trusted turned out to be an offender at that camp. And he said he thought he knew. He thought he knew this person through and through. And just the means that they take for the grooming process, if you will. And Ministry Safe, I think, does a great job of talking about the grooming process in 2 respects: grooming the victim or the child through kind of progressing through that, but they're also grooming the adults in the organization about how they can be trusted and what a good person they are, and that you would never expect them to be an offender. So this isn't fun stuff, but there's things to be aware of. So before I move on to safety from injury, does anybody have any questions or want to share anything about abuse at camp? I didn't really get into the whole having a whole reporting mechanism in place. I'm sure that was part of the training. You know, there's mandatory reporter laws in every state. We certainly recommend, if there is an incident, beside following those mandatory reporting laws, is to report it to your insurance company, because sadly there's a whole team of people that's what they do on a day-to-day basis, and they can help guide the organization through that unfortunate episode. So, any conversation or thoughts around abuse? Yes, sir.
I do know that Wisconsin has had a Pathfinder leader abusing children at one time. It has happened in Wisconsin. Don't dismiss it, it has happened here.
Right. I appreciate that, and it's again, it's an unfortunate reality that I face when I talk to organizations about it could never happen here. You know, we know everybody, it could never happen here. And I think for every organization where it does happen, you often hear them say, "We never thought it could happen here." And so again, just being proactive and on the front end, just how much better it is to prevent this from happening and having to deal with the aftermath of it. I mean, insurance, if you think about it, it's great. It's technically it's a risk financing tool. If something bad happens at your organization, we're there as the insurance company, come in and make it right from a financial perspective. We'll fix the building, we'll restore, the building facilities, that kind of thing. But when there's an injury, essentially the claims through the court system, we're paying them for any economic losses they have, their pain and suffering, and that's it. But in terms of restoring that victim, restoring that reputation to the organization, there isn't really what we can do. We're financing the risk, but it just gets back to, again, the need of preventing it in the first place. And I appreciate you sharing that example. I know there's other things that strike close to home here in conference, right? In Green Bay and some things that happened recently. So it happens every day, unfortunately. But on to better things, right? Unless we want to talk. Any other questions on the abuse piece? And I know I'm down. I'm down, right? I come in from the insurance big company perspective, and we see all the bad stuff, but we see the good too, right? God works in powerful ways in horrible situations, and we see that too. The reason I do what I do is because I don't want to see that happen. It's a value of caring for one another, loving one another, being a shepherd, being a steward, and trying to avoid that bad stuff from happening. About safety from injuries, recreational activities. And again, where it really comes down to us is the selection of the activity, the selection of the people that are going to be in charge of that activity, the training of the people that are going to be in charge of that activity, and just making sure the equipment is right too. So I don't know what all they got going on at this camp. Is there anything high hazard going on? I haven't been here. High ropes, giant swing, no zip line over water or. There's a zip line, all right.
Horses.
Yeah. So the insurance company isn't we're not the don't have fun. We're just saying, please do it as responsibly as we can. So for the actual activity, just making sure that it's the right fit, right? So I think there's things. I've got 3 kids who are now grown. There's things that I would allow them to do as their parent that if I were like a youth leader in an organization, I've never been a youth leader in an organization. It's a disclaimer. I wouldn't recommend for the organization because it's kind of risky. Me as a parent, I'm making that choice for my kid, but am I going to make that choice for all the kids, even with permission forms? All of you, are standing, we call it in loco parentis. You're standing in the place of the parent for the time that the youth is with you. And so just being wise about the selection of the activity that you're engaging in. There are certain things that we as an insurance company don't like, but a lot of things can be made safe if it's done right or correctly. So selection of the activity, making sure that you have enough supervision, and making sure that those people are trained. Speaking of zip lines, it's not horribly uncommon to see where they're not buckled in correctly and kids are falling and or getting their hands in the cables up top. So again, it's just a matter of, I think, training and supervision and the selection of the activity. So I don't want to give you all the bad examples from physical activities, but there are quite a few. So any questions on injury? Yes, ma'am.
Is there a recommended supervision level for, like when you have a group of people, how many?
Right.
ratio?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? The question is about supervision level. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, in our mind, and I had to put ratios as 1 to 12 because to me there should always have 2 adults. But if the activity is just low risk classroom setting, I think very common to see what schools are doing, what other youth organizations are doing. It depends on the age of the kid, right? Because if you have very small kids, you'd have more, it'd be a lower ratio than teens, that kind of thing, classroom settings. So I can't give a number. I can't give a number for the ratio, but just as the activity gets higher, the ratio gets higher. And I'm not seeing like published standards, and there may to be about, you need X number of supervisors for this particular activity, because it really is a sliding scale. So that didn't answer your question very well, but.
Can I just ask you about bouncy
Sure.
houses? You know, we're raising money for Gillette. What do you call bouncy houses?
Oh, bouncy houses, so, yeah. Inflatables, bouncy houses, you know, as long as they're secure, right, that's where we've seen things when they blow off, right, so as long as they're secure, then you've got supervision, and, you know, from our perspective, when you're bringing in stuff from outside, because typically those aren't owned by the church or the organization, there's like safeguards to do, although it's very hard because you're the one that wants the equipment, so to do it, they're not going to go with your agreements. But very, very common. Have a few-step process if you're kind of using outside things, and that's having a written agreement that kind of puts them more on the hook than you. Kind of specify who's responsible, even whose insurance will apply to that. But I mean, in terms of the actual inflatables themselves, it really gets down to well, one, weather forecasting, two, if you know the storm or when the event is coming, not to postpone it, but having them well secured and then well supervised, I think, is where the keys there. Yes, ma'am?
So I can't think of a time when we ever had less than 2 adults
Yeah.
kind of supervising the whole thing. But
Right.
I often think of a time where one adult, you know, maybe they're doing a certain activity and they're hiking with 3 kids. You know, it's
Right.
never one-on-one,
Mhm.
but so
Yeah.
when I heard you say the 2, I was
Yeah.
like, okay, there's times for sure that we've had one adult
Right.
for a short period of time usually.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so and we call it the 2-adult rule, and I think that's an ideal scenario, but just knowing the realities and practicalities of youth serving organizations. I think it's better stated as a no child alone with 1 adult rule, is sometimes how we put it, so that you're never in a case where it's one adult with even 2 kids or 3 kids. But if it's less than that, then there should be 2, ideally, in the thought, right? And it's 2 purposes. One is to avoid incidents of misconduct or abuse, but 2, it's to protect the adult from allegations. And the research, the data will tell you that overwhelmingly the allegations are true, like 95 to 98% of the time they're true, but they can be false, right? So to have those 2 adults protects not only the children, but also protects you as the volunteer or worker from allegations that may not be true.
I think also is the whole idea that if something does happen,
Yes,
one person can get hurt.
right, that's true, yeah.
Where if something
Right.
happens to one and
Yeah.
they see something wrong, then the other person can go get help. Even if they have to leave or they step away and use the telephone or whatever, that other person can get the help to come.
And that's a great point, particularly in the remote setting, right? If they're going off on a hike, then that 1 with 3, that's a great point. If something happened, then what would you do?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
How legal is it, or how ethical is it, or is it right to have waivers to sign? You know, some places
Okay,
you go
sure.
and have fun.
Yeah.
They said, if you sign a waiver, if anything happens,
Yeah.
you're responsible, you're
Yes.
liable.
Yes, great question. I meant to address that, so great time to talk about that. And, you know, as a lawyer, I love waivers, right? But they're not favored by the law, particularly when it comes to minors, you know, those under 18. So I'm not a Wisconsin licensed lawyer, but I took a quick look. I didn't see, some states, they're just invalid for minors regardless. I didn't see that for Wisconsin, but they are definitely disfavored by the law. So I believe they're a good idea. One, to make sure that there's permission for the event. So some places will do a standard permission form for the whole year. And then if they're doing higher risk activities, you know, swimming activities, other type higher risk, have a specific form for that activity as well, which I think is a good idea. But to have the permission for the event, to include the waiver or liability waiver language within the form, I think is good if you kind of work with your local counsel or attorney on that. And then also a form for a consent to emergency medical treatment or authorization is good, and that's typically a separate form. I think it's good to incorporate all of those. It may ultimately be that if something happens and you try to say, hey, they signed a waiver, it won't hold up. But I think it's still a good practice. It's a good idea. Some of the worst things we've seen is, like, for example, we had a drowning where the parent never knew there was going to be a swimming event. So if there had been a waiver, maybe the waiver would have been affected, but the waiver would have said, you know, there's going to be this swimming event and you've signed permission for it. So it serves purposes. I think you should work with your church's local council on that form. So I'm a proponent of whether it ultimately holds up as just a blanket. You're not going to recover is debatable.
So it doesn't really shift liability, it basically presents the fact that, you know, they were aware of what they were getting into.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly helps. I mean, ultimately you want it to kind of cut off the liability, but often won't do that, but it can certainly help in terms of assumption of the risk, or knowing the risk and voluntarily went ahead, or the parent agreed to go ahead and do it. So. And then when we talk about safe from injury, I should mention too, that applies to workers and volunteers too. You know, we're getting older, right? And we're working with you. We want to hang with them and do the things. I'm told I look young for my age, but I'm late 50s, so I can't do the things physically that I want to do. And I can't tell you how many times we've seen claims, either workers' comp or general liability claim, where it's the worker who's trying to do the activity the kids are doing, they got hurt. Whether it's physical game, whether it's saw one on the blob. Is there a blob?
Yes.
Yeah, on the blob, and the pastor got thrown off the blob and then getting hurt when he hit the water. So just, I don't know how you do that, other than talk to your workers and your volunteers about your limitations physically. Because if it does happen and there is an injury, it often comes back to the church. Either if they're a paid employee, it comes back to the church as workers' compensation, or if they're a volunteer, it can come back to the church as a liability claim. How about transportation? So, any transportation going on with Pathfinders? All right. What's the typical mode of transportation? Is it personal vehicles or church-owned vehicles? Personal vehicles. Okay. Okay. So when it comes to church-related transportation, 3 options, right? So the organization-owned vehicle, a rented or leased vehicle, or a personal vehicle. And so regardless of the mode, the church could be liable for all 3 because it's a church-related function. So it's a church-related function. One of your volunteers uses their car, gets in a wreck. Yes, they'll get sued. Yes, they'll go through their insurance, but it'll come back against the church as well because it's a church-sponsored function. So kind of 3 different pieces there, right? A church-owned vehicle. You want to be smart about the selection of the vehicle. So Jonathan, we were talking about 15-passenger vans. That's been a big point of emphasis within yes. So selection of the vehicle, selection of the driver, and then maintenance of the vehicle is what you have on the church-owned side. So selection of the vehicle, hopefully we move past 15-passenger vans. As talking about with Jonathan, it's not just the instability and the rollover potential of the van, it's also the crash worthiness. That they were initially designed as a cargo vehicle. They weren't designed as a passenger vehicle. So the side protection and the roof does not have the structure that a school bus would. So hopefully we move beyond 15-passenger vans for the organization. Love to see minibuses. They're more expensive, of course, but essentially 15-passenger minibus. The church where I work for, we have 2 of them. Often called a multifunction school activity bus, or MFSAB, is one option that's safe. But even minivans or even SUVs, from our perspective, are safer than the passenger vans. So, yes, sir.
I have a question.
All right.
Just so I'm clear, so is 15 the limit or 15 is a no-go?
You're not allowed to have a 15-passenger van as a pastor family.
any church-related activity, Adventist risk management will not allow it at all.
You got one?
I mean,
You want to try? You want to delay one?
the way you stated 15 minute passenger minibus.
That's different, it's a different, so, sorry if I wasn't, so 15 passenger van is out, a 15 passenger minibus essentially looks like a school bus, but small. So it seats 15 people plus the passenger. It meets all federal school bus safety standards. Well, I don't want to go anything. I can say that I assume the conference will be fine with that because it meets all the standards.
That's the only vehicle that I've heard is totally out.
Is it, yeah, so I've heard that too, yeah. And then, regardless of the type of transportation, it's the drivers, right? So again, tension point, right? Even if they're driving their own vehicle, they're driving on behalf of the church, so you're liable for them, so you kind of want to know their driving record. So a thing called MVRs, or motor vehicle reports, whether it's a church-owned vehicle or a personal vehicle, it would be ideal. And I know a lot of organizations don't do it, is to check the MVRs of those that are driving on behalf of the organization. Again, for two reasons. One is to protect the event, so nothing bad happens with a driver who shouldn't be driving. And two is protect the organization, so that if something does happen, you can then show and prove that you've demonstrated due diligence or reasonable care by looking into the background of that driver. So it's awkward, a little uncomfortable, a little easier to do when it's a church-owned vehicle, saying if you want to drive the church vehicle, we need to have your MVR. There are organizations that if you're driving your personal vehicle, the church will ask to have an MVR run on that driver. Also uncomfortable is that if they're driving their own vehicle, their insurance is on the line first. And so some organizations, and we would kind of recommend it too, is to have higher limits than the basic lowest liability limit allowed by law. So we recommend higher limits for those that are driving personal vehicles. But again, someone's likely not going to raise their insurance liability coverage just to drive on behalf of the church. But it's another safety practice.
Does umbrella cover that?
So does umbrella cover? So typically, if you have an umbrella, it will sit on top of the commercial auto. If it is not a church-owned vehicle, it's a personal vehicle. There's a separate coverage that the church would need to have called hired and non-owned auto. That kind of covers that situation of either a rented vehicle or
I mean, your own personal vehicle and you have an umbrella policy.
Oh, if you mean the person has an umbrella? Yes, that should come into play. Typically it would. Yes. And any other transportation questions?
I mean, this is piggybacking off of
Okay,
hers.
yeah.
But am I understanding correctly that, like, basically if an accident happened and it was your vehicle, they would come after your insurance first, then your umbrella and policy, and then the church's
Well,
insurance?
that'd be a fight, right? So, the lawyers will fight it out, right? Typically, the coverage follows the vehicle. So I know, like, the organization's insurer, like Church Mutual, would say that person's personal auto policy is first, and then their umbrella, and then come to us.
Okay.
But that's something the lawyers on the other side would fight about.
Because they would try to get to you?
Yeah.
Right.
Although there's an umbrella sitting there, that's typically $1 million, so the lawyers would go for that money. It's usually when, they have the minimal limits, 25,000, 50,000 limit. That goes out the window real quick, and then they come to the church for the rest. So, I'll tell one more story. They're like horror stories, but it's true things. So, it sounds like a movie, but it's not. So, a person was driving to a church picnic. She had a horrible driving record, but the church didn't know that. She had like 7 people in the car, and this is true. She lost control of the car. It overturned. A lady in the car got ejected from the car onto railroad tracks, passenger railroad tracks. A commuter train came along and actually ran over her legs and her son was in the car. And the church got sued, of course, because they didn't know that the person that was driving on behalf of the church for the church event had a horrible driver. Sorry.
So what if, you said something about a higher non-owned vehicle insurance paid for by the church? Or something like that, that was one reason.
It's just making sure that because there's commercial auto coverage,
Yeah.
covers the church.
Yeah.
You want to make sure that there's also coverage for, it's called non-owned and hired auto, or NOAA, NOHA. There's a separate kind of coverage part. Some places it's contained within the auto, some it's contained within the liability package. But it's making sure that that's part of the coverage for those incidents where there's something involving a vehicle that the church doesn't own. Yes, sir?
How hard is it to do the MVR?
It's easy, relatively. So a lot of places, we have a lot of vendor partners, and so one of them is a background check source. I don't think Pathfinder uses them. Is it Sterling that you all use? Sterling? I wouldn't be surprised if Sterling didn't have the option. We Church Mutual partners with a place called Trusted Employees that do background checks. Is an MDR option right there for that. So I would think Sterling probably has that option if they're, you've seen it, right? So, yeah. Then lastly, and then we can open it up for any questions, is safe from violence. So it's not a top frequent cause of loss for us. It's not a top severity cause of loss for us, but episodes of violence, like episodes of sexual abuse, are horrible. So it's even less frequent than sexual abuse. I said we see 3 to 4 sexual abuse claims per week. An episode of church violence, we see maybe 1 or 2 a year, thankfully. But they're bad, right? And they're not a top cause of dollars out, because it's hard to say the church was negligent. And it used to be the church really had no obligation to have any type of security force or security measures in place. But things have changed somewhat, right, as more episodes happen. So there can be an argument that a church really should have some sort of security measures in place. And just, like I said, it's not something that we see a lot, but the impact for those that do have it, and again, I'll always say they never thought it would happen here, is tremendous. So just having a plan in place at your church, even less common than like at the main church service, is to have a plan for those youth activities. Just because you don't know what's going on in kids' lives, people's lives. You don't know if it's another minor that could potentially commit an act of violence, and so having some sort of thought through a plan or a procedure for safety of your youth from violence, even in the camp setting, right? Is there any type of restriction of access or check-in for guests or vendors or that kind of thing to kind of head off the episodes of violence? So, churches run the gamut, right? From doing nothing, which a lot of them do nothing, unfortunately, to having armed security at services, which some of them do that, to things in between, where you just have volunteers who are there just to keep an eye out. I mean, really, the whole concept is a layered approach, right? Because the threat typically is going to come from the outside. So having somebody outside, start in the parking lot, who has the ability to communicate with somebody inside if they see something or a threat comes from the outside. And then just work the way in, parking lot to the entrance, to the sanctuary, to even up to the front of the church. So again, youth activities, I think it's important to think about, particularly for camp settings, as I mentioned. I think the typical midweek, I went through 2 of them, man. The typical midweek meetings, perhaps not so much, but just to think through what you would do. I know some places, they just do it mostly with volunteers, just eyes and ears, just to keep an eye out and to be able to call out. Oh, third time's a charm. I don't even talk that much. And then, you know, Church Mutual is part of our, the resources that we offer as part of our, we have a water temperature sensor program. Part of that is called Pull for Police, and all that is a device that, say I was up here and there was I saw something coming in or something happened, I could just pull this device and immediately dials 911, the highest level priority, meaning it's going to be a shooting type episode, and so it triggers a SWAT response. And so just having kind of thought through what you're going to do from a church perspective on that. Are there any questions on that? I feel like I've been like just a downer. I don't like to be, right? Because we like to bring solutions. And so I know Advanced Risk has a lot of great solutions. Church Mutual has a lot of free solutions on our website. There's a whole safety resources tab on our page that goes into all the resources that we have, from armed intruder preparedness, for example, to sexual abuse prevention, to child safety that are available to you. So I hope you would take advantage of those or other resources that are available. Are there other questions? Anything safety, insurance related? I'm not, I was hoping to have a compatriot with me to handle the insurance coverage part, because I don't do the sales part, or don't necessarily deal with the policy so much as I deal with trying to prevent losses from happening in the first place. So, yes, ma'am.
What are some more examples of like violence that?
You don't want? You really want those? They're mostly in the ones that we see are mostly in the church setting. I wouldn't say we've seen a lot in the youth setting. And some of the most challenging, I think, are kind of the midweek ones. So probably one of the worst ones that I saw, because I'm heading out to California in a couple of weeks to talk to folks out there, where they had one where the church was the meeting place for this custodial exchange of kids. Husband and wife were in a custodial situation, so the church agreed to be the meeting place for that. And for whatever reason, the father, when he came to drop them off, shot the mother, shot the kids, and shot the person from the church who was kind of chaperoning the custodial situation. So that's unusual. I don't know that there's a lot the church could do about that, but probably the one that bothers me the most as a church person was a 8:30 a.m. service on a Sunday morning service. Pretty small attendance, right? The pastor's preaching, and this gentleman just walks up the aisle. Didn't recognize him. He had no connection to the church. Walks up when we got up. He had some exchange of words with the pastor that weren't heard. Pulled out a .45 caliber pistol and shot 4 times before it jammed, hit the pastor's Bible. It kind of went up like confetti. A lot of the congregation thought it was part of some sort of illustration. But it shot him in the heart. One shot hit him. Unfortunately, he died from that episode. And it turns out this individual had no connection to the church, had no dispute with the pastor. He had a history of mental illness, was dealing with Lyme's disease, apparently, that left lesions on his brain, was the claim. And kind of ironically, I guess, is that he never stood trial for that because he was deemed incompetent by reason of insanity. And so he's in a mental institution. But again, that gets a little bit to the layered approach, right? So have somebody in the back, ideally in the parking lot, just to greet them, talk to them, see what's going on. You can learn a lot that way, just to interact with people. And maybe that could have been headed up. I don't know whether he was allowed or able just to walk all the way down in the middle of the service and have this exchange with the pastor. Yes, sir.
Normally, all our activities are in-state, but next summer, we're all headed to Wyoming.
Yes.
Does that present insurance problems?
No. Going to Wyoming, so no. Excuse me. The coverage goes throughout the United States. If you're going overseas, you might want to look at kind of some specific coverage for overseas missions and that kind of thing. But within the United States, no. But again, you would call that a higher risk setting. So if we have increased supervision and some other considerations to that, including transportation, you're probably fine. Or you drive a caravan. So, yes.
Okay, so as Pathfinders, we do a lot of honors. I just want to know what your thoughts are on anything with doing skateboarding, snowboarding, trampoline, scooters, any kind of things we need to know, anything? Archery, got anything we should know? Or?
I should probably, I'll send out, there's like, just free, not each of those, but a lot of those, just some basic safeguards, if you will. So I think I can get that around to Zach and then get it around to the group, just kind of some basic safeguards for some of those activities. Yes. That sounds fun though, that's that fun versus safe.
I know years ago in our schools, they said like, no snowboarding, but you can ski. That was years ago, so now I kind of we switched now that we can snowboard.
I guess that makes sense if we can have access to knowing what the percentage more or less the risk are, on different line items. That'll, as adults, it'll give a little more, if I see kids skateboarding and, on a skateboard park, I don't see any danger, but maybe the reality is that, 60% of those kids at some point are gonna have a pretty serious accident. They're like, whoa, wait a minute, we gotta, consider this, or not consider the other,
Yes. Anything else? I'm not sure how much, I think I had an hour, so I think I'm right on time there, if I'm not mistaken. No, I just want to encourage you, like I said, I don't share examples, tell war stories, but really to have a point that these things do happen every day, that many of them can be prevented with reasonable steps, and just encourage you to consider that and just appreciate what you do, in terms of serving with the youth is so important, and just want to encourage you to do that in as safe a way as possible. Appreciate your time and the opportunity. Yes, sir.
You miss practicing law?
Do I miss practicing? No. So yes and no. I don't miss billable hours, they call it, where every 6 minutes of your life were recorded so that you could bill it out. I don't miss that at all. But the courtroom is a love-hate thing, right? Because it's to get, you see on TV the trials and that kind of thing, but getting there is the thing, and 90% of the time it settles or resolves. So all that paperwork to get to that point is not a lot of fun. Thank you, Ben. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve, for making the time to come up and chat with us. I appreciate that. So, as we said, we've adjusted our schedule. We're going to start the next session at 4:30, but let's take a 5-10 minutes at the most break. You need to get up, walk around in the restroom, and then we'll get you started as soon as you get back.